The luxury jet gleamed under the golden glow of the setting sun, parked on a private runway reserved only for the elite. A red carpet stretched from the stairs to the tarmac, where wealthy businessmen and celebrities strutted in designer suits and glimmering jewelry. Soft chatter, polished smiles, and the occasional clink of champagne glasses filled the air. It was a world of power, exclusivity, and untouchable status. Among them, a man in a worn-out black jacket and a simple backpack moved without drawing attention. His dark hair was slightly messy, a light beard covered his face, and his posture was relaxed as if he had nothing to prove. He didn't fit the environment, yet he walked towards the plane with effortless confidence. The flight attendant, Vanessa, a woman who prided herself on recognizing high-status individuals, noticed him immediately. Her sharp eyes scanned him from head to toe, and her lips curled slightly in disapproval. A man like that? On a private jet like this? Impossible. As the passengers found their seats, Vanessa made sure to greet each one with a charming smile, offering them fine champagne and ensuring their every need was met. But when she passed the man in the worn-out jacket, she pretended not to see him, as if he were invisible. He took a seat by the window, gazing outside at the city skyline, unaffected by her cold treatment. She whispered to her colleague, a younger attendant who was double-checking the list, "Are you sure we checked all passengers? That one?" She subtly nodded towards him. "He looks out of place." Her colleague glanced at the list, then back at the man. "He's on the manifest," she confirmed. Vanessa frowned. Perhaps a personal assistant of some billionaire, a last-minute replacement. Whatever the case, she had no intention of treating him like the other guests. As the jet doors closed and the engines roared to life, she made her way down the aisle once more. This time, she stopped near his seat. Her tone was polite but firm, her smile forced. "Sir, I believe you might have taken the wrong seat. This section is reserved for exclusive guests. There are available seats in the back." The man finally turned his head to look at her. His expression was calm, his dark eyes unreadable. "I'm fine here. Thank you." Something in the way he spoke, in the quiet confidence of his voice, unsettled Vanessa. She was used to people fawning over her attention or immediately obeying her commands. But this man, he didn't react like the others. Instead, he simply tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the situation. The passengers nearby had begun to notice. A businessman in an expensive suit, seated just a few rows ahead, stole a glance at the exchange, his brow furrowing slightly. There was something familiar about that man's face. Vanessa, feeling a sudden need to regain control, exhaled sharply through her nose and straightened her back. "Very well," she said in a clipped tone before turning on her heels. As she walked away, the man leaned back in his seat and looked out the window once more, a small, knowing smile on his lips. Little did she know, the flight and her life was about to take an unexpected turn. The jet smoothly lifted off the runway, climbing into the evening sky as the city lights shimmered below. Inside the cabin, luxury reigned, soft leather seats, ambient golden lighting, and the quiet hum of conversation as the elite passengers settled in. Vanessa, ever the picture of professionalism, moved gracefully through the aisle, offering champagne and personalized service to each guest. Except one. As she poured a sparkling golden liquid into the crystal glasses of a group of investors, she stole a glance at the man in the worn-out jacket. He sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, showing no sign of impatience or discomfort. There was something odd about him. He wasn't gawking at the extravagant surroundings like an outsider. He wasn't fidgeting, nor did he seem the least bit out of place. It was as if he belonged there, but that was impossible. She made her way down the aisle again, stopping near him just long enough to skip him deliberately. No champagne, no warm welcome. Nothing. Some nearby passengers noticed but said nothing, exchanging subtle smirks or disapproving glances. The businessman from earlier, seated just a few feet away, found himself watching the exchange again, tapping his fingers against the armrest. Why does this man look so familiar? Moments later, Vanessa walked past again, this time tending to a blonde socialite in an emerald dress. The woman giggled, twirling the stem of her glass between her fingers as she chatted about her latest investment. As Vanessa turned, she heard a voice, calm, steady, and polite. "Excuse me," the man said. "Could I get a glass of water?" She stopped mid-step, barely turning her head. The request was simple, yet her jaw tightened as if she had been asked for something far more demanding. Slowly, she faced him, her lips curving into an icy, professional smile. "Only priority passengers receive full service," she replied smoothly, her voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Silence stretched between them. A few passengers glanced over, sensing the tension. The businessman across the aisle raised an eyebrow, his suspicion deepening. The man didn't react with anger. He didn't argue or insist. Instead, he gave a small, almost amused smile, tilting his head slightly before murmuring, "I see." Then, just like that, he turned back to the window, as if the conversation had never happened. Something about his reaction made Vanessa uneasy. Most people would have protested, demanded fairness, or at the very least shown some irritation. But he acted as if he expected this treatment. The businessman, watching the exchange, exhaled sharply, rubbing his chin. His brain was working, trying to put the pieces together. He had seen that face before. He was sure of it. Vanessa, on the other hand, felt a rush of satisfaction. That should put him in his place. But what she didn't realize was that her own place in this flight was about to crumble. The jet cruised smoothly through the clouds, the hum of the engines blending with the quiet murmur of conversation. Vanessa, feeling triumphant from her earlier interaction, continued her rounds with a smug air of superiority. She made sure to shower extra attention on the well-dressed passengers, the ones who belonged in this environment. Yet every time she passed by that man, sitting so effortlessly in his seat, her irritation grew. Something about his presence unsettled her. Why wasn't he reacting? Why wasn't he uncomfortable? Most people would have felt out of place after such an insult, maybe even shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But this man, he just sat there, calm, composed, almost amused. She needed to make sure he knew his place. As she rolled the beverage cart down the aisle once more, she noticed he had slightly adjusted his posture. His shoulder barely brushed against the side of the cart, a minor, almost imperceptible contact. But to Vanessa, it was an opportunity. With a subtle flick of her wrist, she tilted the champagne bottle just enough for an entire glass of ice-cold water to spill onto his lap. Gasps rippled through the cabin as the freezing liquid soaked into his jacket and shirt. A few passengers turned their heads, some covering their mouths in silent shock. The businessman who had been watching everything stiffened in his seat. Vanessa let out a sharp, theatrical gasp. "Oh, what a clumsy mistake," she said, her voice dripping with insincere apology. But the slight smirk playing at the corner of her lips betrayed her true intentions. All eyes were now on the man. This was the moment where most people would break. Anger, embarrassment, a demand for an apology. But instead, he did something unexpected. He looked down at his wet clothes, took a slow breath, then lifted his gaze straight at her. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared. And in that moment, something changed. A chill ran down Vanessa's spine. It wasn't the reaction she had anticipated. His eyes weren't filled with humiliation or frustration. Instead, they held something far more unnerving: certainty. For the first time, Vanessa felt a flicker of doubt. Who is this man? The businessman, still watching, suddenly sat forward. His fingers tapped anxiously against his armrest, his brows furrowed in deep thought. And then, in a barely audible whisper, he muttered to himself, "No, it can't be." Vanessa, oblivious to the growing tension, crossed her arms and let out a condescending scoff. "You don't belong here," she said, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. More whispers, more glances. The businessman's eyes darted between Vanessa and the man in the wet jacket, his mind racing. He had seen that face before. He knew exactly who that was. And if he was right, Vanessa had just made the worst mistake of her life. A heavy silence settled over the cabin. The usual hum of quiet conversation had faded, replaced by an uncomfortable tension. The businessman's pulse quickened as he studied the man's face, his mind racing through distant memories. He had seen him before, many times, but where? Vanessa, however, was still basking in her own arrogance. She had humiliated the out-of-place passenger in front of everyone, made it clear that he didn't belong here. She folded her arms, tilting her chin slightly upward, satisfied with her own display of power. But something wasn't right. The man in the soaked jacket remained perfectly still, perfectly calm. No anger, no frustration. Just that same unreadable expression, his dark eyes locked onto hers. And the longer he stared, the more uneasy she became. It was as if he wasn't just looking at her, he was seeing right through her. The businessman, still watching intently, suddenly sucked in a breath. His eyes widened in realization, and without thinking, he blurted out under his breath, "Oh my God, it's him." Vanessa's head snapped toward him. "What?" she asked sharply. The businessman didn't answer. His fingers tightened around the armrests of his seat, his expression shifting from confusion to utter disbelief. How could he have been so blind? How could she? This wasn't just some ordinary passenger. And then it happened. One of the passengers, a younger woman sitting across the aisle, gasped loudly. She grabbed her phone, her fingers moving frantically across the screen. Within seconds, she turned the device toward her seatmate, whispering, "Look at this. Look at him." More whispers spread. More heads turned. Vanessa's stomach twisted. She glanced around, confused, suddenly aware that the energy in the cabin had shifted. Why were they all looking at him differently now? Why were they whispering? The businessman finally spoke, his voice low, serious, almost reverent. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Vanessa's heart pounded against her ribs. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her tone laced with irritation, but deep inside she felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Doubt. The businessman exhaled sharply, then turned to the silent man in the wet jacket, the man she had just humiliated. His expression softened, a mixture of awe and regret flashing in his eyes. Then, with a slow, almost hesitant nod, he addressed him directly. "Mr. Reeves." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Vanessa froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled slightly. The name hit her like a thunderclap, ringing in her ears, making her skin prickle with sudden, paralyzing realization. The man she had ignored, insulted, and drenched in ice water was Keanu Reeves. The silence in the cabin was deafening. For a moment, it felt as if the entire world had stopped moving. Keanu Reeves. The name echoed in Vanessa's mind, sending a cold wave through her body. Her throat went dry, her confident stance faltering as the weight of her actions came crashing down. Passengers who had earlier ignored the scene were now fully invested, some whispering in disbelief, others discreetly pulling out their phones. They had all heard the stories. The Hollywood legend known not just for his movies, but for his humility, his generosity, his kindness, and she had treated him like a nobody. Vanessa swallowed hard, her mind scrambling for an explanation, a defense, anything to undo what she had just done. But before she could speak, Keanu finally moved. Slowly, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His wet jacket clung to him, but he didn't seem to notice or care. He looked up at her with the same unreadable expression, calm, patient, dangerous in its quiet intensity. Then, in a voice so controlled yet powerful, he spoke. "Tell me something." He tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "Would you have treated me differently if you knew who I was?" Vanessa's stomach twisted. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The businessman, still watching, let out a breath he had been holding. He knew there was no right answer to that question, no escape. Keanu didn't need her to answer. He already knew. Everyone did. He sat back again, looking out the window as if the conversation was already over, as if she wasn't even worth his time, and somehow that silence was worse than if he had shouted at her. A movement in the aisle caught everyone's attention. The pilot had stepped out of the cockpit. His sharp gaze scanned the cabin, instantly landing on Vanessa. He took in the scene, the soaked jacket, the shaken expressions, the tension thick enough to cut. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded, his voice firm, authoritative. Vanessa's breath hitched. She straightened her back, desperately trying to salvage control. "There was a misunderstanding," she rushed out. A passenger was causing disruption, and..." A dry chuckle cut her off. The pilot's eyes darkened as he turned fully toward her. His voice was dangerously low. "Do you even know who you're talking about?" Vanessa felt the floor disappear beneath her. Passengers were already murmuring louder. Phones were recording. The businessman smirked knowingly. "And Keanu Reeves?" He simply leaned back in his seat, watching the world undo Vanessa in real time. Vanessa's pulse pounded in her ears. "Do you even know who you're talking about?" The pilot's words kept replaying in her mind, each repetition sinking her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her gaze darted to Keanu, hoping, praying for some kind of mercy. But he wasn't even looking at her anymore. He had turned back to the window, his posture relaxed, as if none of this even mattered to him. And maybe, to him, it didn't. She wasn't important enough to hold his attention. The realization stung. Passengers were watching, some with shock, others with quiet satisfaction, knowing they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Phones were out, cameras were rolling. The entire world was about to see what had just happened on this flight. Vanessa's legs felt weak. She needed to fix this. Fast. "Mr. Reeves," she said quickly, forcing a smile. I didn't know. If I had realized..." Keanu's head turned slightly. Not fully, just enough for his cold, unreadable gaze to meet hers. The way he looked at her was worse than any insult. "You didn't need to know who I was," he said simply. "You just needed to know how to treat people." Vanessa froze. The businessman sitting nearby let out a low whistle. "Oof, that's it for her." The pilot sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Then, without another word, he gestured toward the exit. 2 crew members stepped forward. Vanessa's stomach dropped. "Wait, what?" "You're done," the pilot said firmly. "We're making an unscheduled landing." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Vanessa's world tilted. "No, please," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. I can explain." But there was nothing to explain. The jet began its descent, the engines shifting pitch. A few passengers exchanged glances, knowing exactly what was happening. Others held back smirks. Vanessa turned to Keanu one last time, desperate. "Please," she begged under her breath. "I made a mistake. I was stressed. But Keanu didn't answer. He didn't need to. The door was already closing on her fate. Minutes later, as she was escorted off the plane, she could still feel their eyes on her. The cameras, the whispers, the weight of a single unforgettable mistake. Keanu Reeves, still seated by the window, watched the sky as the jet lifted back into the air, his journey continuing as if she had never even existed. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Who would you have reacted to this situation? Let us know below, and stay tuned for the next story.